who's going to talk about defensive measures and specifically what sort of adversary actions we take in the face of adversity. So, over to you.
Thanks, Sunil. Okay. Hopefully my voice gets picked up by this. I'll come over here and start over here from the beginning. Maybe that works. Does that work? Even higher. I'm going to run out of shirt here. Yeah, so what Bryson was just talking about, I'm actually going to talk a lot about, I guess in a way, how none of that really works. And yeah, so yeah, I've been working on this stuff for maybe about 2 years, and this is the first time that I've given it on video, and this is actually the most public version of this that I've given. There's a lot of things that I took out of previous versions of this talk because of that. And we can talk about those at a separate point. But so, you know, it was about 2 years ago I was sitting there, and I got my start in information security back in 2004 when, cybersecurity, I guess. When the place I was working at had the FBI show up, and they gave us a victim notification and said, hey, you know what? We need the disks from this IP address because you've been compromised. And I really didn't play much of a role there at all. I ran the DD command, and that was about it, and handed that off to people that knew what they were doing. But at the time, they were saying, you know what, everybody here, you guys have been compromised by the Russians. Oh my God, they're taking over all of these supercomputing centers and Department of Defense computers and so forth. It turned out to be a 16-year-old kid in Uppsala, Sweden. But from 2005 to 2015, basically my entire career was working Chinese APT intrusions, figuring out what their TTPs were. Oh my God. And that was it. That was a lot of fun, but you know, I was working against the same adversaries for basically 10 years. Around that same time, in 2007, this new thing came out called 76 Service, which offered GOSI as the first malware as a service. And we're still dealing with GOSI to this day. Similarly, in about 2008, we found out about Zeus after the, I think it was the IRS intrusions at that point. Those folks have been persistent since then. A lot of the folks that were part of the Zeus crew are now part of the Drydex crew, and we're still dealing with them. Another group that spawned out of that group was what is the Dyer and Trickbot crew these days. Again, you know, started in 2014, and they're still around today. So I was sitting there, and I'm like thinking about this and looking at this, and I'm like, you know what? Like, I've been doing information security work for like 15 years now almost, and I'm dealing with the same people. Like, we are still fighting the same people. And it's like only a few same people, a few handfuls. At the same time, it made me think about this post that I saw on Twitter where this individual posted that cybersecurity is one of the few domains where the edge of human performance meets the edge of human performance. And basically, I don't know what that person really meant by that, but what I took it to mean is that, you know, no matter what kind of tools or controls or things we put into place, we are just going to continually build, and the people that are playing at the top level of the game are always going to be playing at the top level of the game against the adversary. All right, so, and when you get down to it and when you really think about it, like, yeah, there's hundreds of people that like start getting tools, go on hack forums, and then push out like Predator Paint or some like generic keylogger or as a root or whatever. Andrew's really loud, by the way. He's a much louder talker than I am, apparently. But the people that are kind of at the top of the game, the Dridex crew, the TrickBot crew, the people that are running the curs and so forth, they are they're always going to be working in lockstep to combat whatever defensive measures we put into place as well. So thinking about that, I sat down and I investigated a whole bunch of different things that defenders were doing. And when I say defenders, I mean defenders writ large, including law enforcement, and what kind of impact that had upon volumes of cybercrime from those groups. And I looked at signatures. That was one of the first things. The group that I work in at SecureWorks, that's mostly what we do. We create small Python scripts to try to detect malware on endpoint agents. And then there's also the group which creates network countermeasures to do the same. So snort signatures, Suricata signatures, what have you. The problem with that was, at that point, you are training towards the thing that you're using to detect and measure things. So of course, there's a rise in whatever you're detecting as you create new signatures. That's not really a good thing to measure. When I created this, the first, one of the early versions of this slide deck, I showed it to an analyst, and she came back and she was like, oh, you know what? That rise in Dridex activity, does that correlate to the DDE auto vulnerability in Microsoft Word? I thought that was interesting. So what I tried to do was I laid out vulnerabilities as vulnerabilities were being discovered and publicized. And I tried to figure out if that led to a rise in any cybercrime or any malware family that was associated with that. Kind of interestingly, there was not any significant correlation between vulnerabilities being released and any malware family being deployed onto and detected at endpoints or on the network. The one situation where that doesn't hold up is with exploit kits. Whenever there is a web vulnerability that's released, there is a rise in exploit kit traffic being detected. I also tried to take a look at patching, but that proved to be pretty complicated, especially from my visibility at a managed security services provider. I don't know when. It's really hard to tell when people are deploying patches to systems. So even though the patches are released, say, on Patch Tuesday, and that was what I first tried to do, was went through each Patch Tuesday and tried to see, all right, is there a decrease afterwards of malware being detected on hosts? And I don't know when people have actually deployed their patches from Patch Tuesday. Some places might want to test for a whole week before they deploy those. Some people might want to deploy them right away. So that didn't really show up, and I didn't really see any correlation either of malware rising or declining. When a few years ago I did some work with more targeted intrusions and whether or not eviction in targeted intrusion and incident response cases resulted in what kind of behaviors we saw result from that. A guy named Phil Burdett actually gave that talk at RSA in 2015. We're not going to talk about that here. We're going to talk about general cybercrime rather than targeted intrusions. Took a look at diplomatic agreements. Again, that only has to deal with APT stuff. There was a decline in Chinese activity. We know that. And now there's a rise, which is kind of nice. Well, interesting, I guess. Maybe not nice. So the things that I took a look at that we're going to talk about here today, though, were what happened with IOC releases, what happened with patching things that cybercrime was exploiting directly to make money or gather credentials, what happens with botnet takedowns, what happens with civil cases, and what happens whenever people are indicted or arrested. So what do you think I found? I'm going to give the entire talk away in the next slide. What do you think I found? Some correlation with arrests, and that's about it? No, probably the highest arrests. OK. There was someone else that said something. It's complicated. It's not too complicated, actually. I don't think it's too complicated. Yeah, so basically, the only things that I've found that have impacted cybercrime writ large have been diplomatic actions or arrests. That's it. as far as declining, the only things that have resulted in a decline in cybercrime are those two things. Now, some other things have resulted in increases in cybercrime, and those weren't actually apparent at first. And when I lined those up and found those, it was pretty surprising. So that's the entire talk. Now I'm going to go into the details. Yes. So the defensive measures. So first, there's this concept of like, oh, we're going to gather all the IOCs. And if I have the IOCs, I can block stuff. I can stop cybercrime, or I can stop intrusions, whatever. So I tried to take a look at IOC releases that were specifically targeting cybercrime. There's not many. At the time, there was a tiny sample set of 2, and these were government releases of IOCs for cybercrime. What I found was, and so in these 2 cases, a government organization said, you know what, we're going to block, we want you all to block these IOCs on a specific date regarding a specific threat. What I found was that when we took those IOCs and looked to see when we had last seen them within our client base, and almost all of them we had seen previously. They were pretty common threats. But we hadn't seen them hit anything in our client base for 140 days beforehand. So those IOCs were 5 months stale. That was basically useless. Most of them, we had seen them first 200 days beforehand. So that's almost 7 months beforehand. So what I took away from that was governments are really slow at sharing things, and they need to really speed up if they want to have any sort of impact in a defensive way and decreasing cybercrime with their sharing mechanisms. The other thing is, with APT IOC releases, usually you'll get a whole bunch of hashes. You can go out and you can grab that malware, and that malware oftentimes will be stuff that you've never seen before. So you can take that malware from VirusTotal or whatever malware repository you're looking at and spend your time creating more robust signatures rather than IOCs, and you get some utility out of that. With the cybercrime releases, most of the cybercrime malware is stuff that we've all been dealing with. We deal with on a day-to-day basis, and we already have signatures in place. So you don't get that added benefit either. So IOC releases for cybercrime really had 0 impact, but it's hard to tell if that would have an impact if it were to be done and executed well. This data is actually based off of a presentation that ESET did at Virus Bulletin. There we go. And it was pretty cool. What the researcher had done was he pulled out the releases of Chrome's patching to combat DriedX's web injects, or when they added protection measures that would overcome DriedX's web injects, which allow DriedX to steal credentials from your browser. What really was in that data was that, on average, the DriedX folks have web injects working. Chrome will release a mitigation to stop that, and within 10 days on average, the DriedX actors have overcome those protections and their web injects work again. In the largest case, it was 27 days. Okay, so 4 weeks. At best case, you have 4 weeks from some sort of patching mechanism before those actors that are targeting that overcome it. And in one case, it was a single day. Yes, you have a question? Oh, is it normal? No, it's not really normal. It's actually kind of skewed towards the short end. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Are there any other questions? Feel free to interrupt. I was a professor for years, so I feel good with interruptions. Yes, so the question was, is this distribution normal, or is it skewed to either side, or what have you? Yeah, so most of the, in most cases, I guess the mode is shorter than 10 days rather than a normal distribution like a bell curve. I should probably make that slide look like that, huh? Yeah, that's a good idea. So the next thing that I took a look at was I just took volumes of specific threats and I plotted out law enforcement actions against them and what happened. So at first I took a look at this. I threw together just CryptoLocker and Game Over Zeus. Now, there's some issues with Game Over Zeus detections there because there are multiple variants of Zeus, and some of the things that we have labeled as Game Over Zeus really will detect Zeus in general writ large. So some of the activities not exactly Bogachev's activity. But threw that out there, and I threw it out into month buckets. This is just, you gather all of your, and actually I'm not working on raw IDS data. Luckily, we have all of our raw ticket data that we can say, oh, these people have felt the need to escalate this as a compromised host. And pull that into there. And this is a good time for me to put a disclaimer about my data. And for the most part, the rest of this presentation is based off of this sort of data set. It's largely US-centric, a bit UK-centric too, and then followed by Western Europe and then APAC after that. So the distribution or things that are happening are mostly the US and Western Europe. It's based on corporate networks, not people's home hosts. Corporate networks tend to be a bit cleaner than home hosts. It's based upon detections on the endpoint and the network data. I'm really working off of the things that have been escalated as you have a compromised host on your network. So so roughly it means this is a compromised host on your network. And I'm really kind of measuring the volume of compromised hosts amongst many corporate networks at this point. I'm missing spam and fraud volumes. So the amount of spam that comes out from any kind of spam bot, I'm not measuring that here. I'm measuring the number of hosts that have been compromised by that spam bot. I also don't have fraud losses. I tried to talk with some financials about that a few times, but I've never quite got that data to be able to measure that. And the data runs from the 1st of January 2011 until today. My data set stops and is missing before January 1st, 2011. And then in September 2017, we had a data ingest problem that's really hard to tease out. It's not like a pure duplication thing. I call that out in some of the graphs later on. We'll see that. Yes? Oh, you need to know a thing? OK, so basically that's the issue with the signatures and measuring based off of signatures. So if you know a thing, and if you create a way to detect something or to measure something, you need to be able to know about that malware before you can start measuring it. So in one case, we'll talk about it specifically where there weren't detections in place to detect something. So really, the gulf or the lack of detection there doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't data there. It just means that we didn't know about it before that point. You know. So does that make sense? Cool. Cool. And so based on the previous talk, one of my proposals from this is hopefully, and maybe, we can create some sort of framework like has happened in the previous years where we can measure the impact on cybercrime, and it's not this thing that's biased off of people's products or services. Usually you see those things and it's like, hey, you know what? If you buy our email detection thing, you will reduce spam volumes by X. Or if you buy our endpoint agent, you're going to detect whatever intrusions by Y. Almost all of those measurement things that gets published or pushed out there are based on that. And basically, all of my data kind of says that I'm not trying to say this service or whatever is going to result in a decrease in activity. It really is pure data. And also, I'm missing the fraud losses and the spam volumes, as well as probably some other data sources. Does it make sense? Question? No? Comment? Yeah? Yes. We'll stand together.
Okay, so you were talking about how you were pushing back cybercrime, but it's kind of a bacteria-like effect when you push something to the point that they have to change, and afterwards it becomes even worse. I don't know how you could measure that.
That's a really good concept, and I'll mention that a little bit here. Cool. Can you hear me still? I have a quiet voice. It doesn't really carry well. So going back to that previous graph from the law enforcement takedowns against Game Over Zeus and the Zeus crew, as well as the takedown, what I did was I dug deeper into it. Rather than looking at it at a month bucket, I pulled it out into a day bucket. And a really interesting thing jumped out of the data whenever I looked at the money mule arrests. After there was a money mule arrest, or they performed arrests against a group of money mules, there was actually a rise in hosts compromised with Game Over Zeus. And I thought that was kind of interesting, and I pulled out the actual numbers here. So for the 4 weeks before the money mules were arrested in April of 2014, we had an average of 10 compromised hosts that we detected with Game Over Zeus, or 1.5 a day. Or, yes, and then the 3 weeks before, it was 9 per week. But then the 3 weeks after the money mule arrests, there was an average of 17 compromised hosts with Game Over Zeus per week. So that was kind of interesting, and like I saw that and I was like, huh, that's odd. So I decided to take a look at a group that is very related to them, which are the Drydex folks. So I pulled Drydex out and Locky, and then again, charted it against a month time scale. Looked at the Ginkgoda and Turkan arrest. Those guys were money mule managers. They were arrested in February of 2014 or 2015. I looked at the Smilex arrest. I looked at what happened with the Drydex Bot 220 takedown. So Drydex Bot 220 targeted, or sinkhole, I guess. Drydex Bot 220 targeted the UK and the US roughly. That was the bot that Smilex ran. And then I also took a look at the February 2016 European Money Mule Action 2. That was also a set of arrests which largely targeted the Dyer and Drydex crews. So it should show some sort of impact on Drydex. And then the UK Money Mule arrest in November 2016, which also targeted folks which were performing money laundering and transferring money for the Drydex crew. So it's kind of hard to see here, but I broke it out and I pulled it out into daily buckets again. So the February 2015 money mule arrests of Ginkgoda and Turkan. Before they were arrested, we were detecting roughly 3.2 new Drydex hosts compromised per week. Afterwards, it was 19.3 compromised hosts per week. In February 2016, before we were detecting 9.6 compromised Drydex hosts per week. Afterwards, 24 per week. But that first week right here, like, there's something going on here. Maybe something else happened. So I removed that, and if I remove that first week after the money mule arrests, we still have 17 new compromised hosts per week after the money mule arrests for the next 4 weeks, or 3 weeks after that, I guess. But then in November of 2016, there's kind of a smaller gap here. Beforehand, for months beforehand, there was an average of 3.2 compromised hosts from Drydex. Afterwards, an average of 5 per week. That's not much of a gap, not much of a jump. The 4 weeks previous and the 4 weeks afterwards, beforehand, the 4 weeks previous, we detected 4 compromised hosts per week on average, and afterwards 5 compromised hosts per week. What's going on with November slightly, and I think what's going on in November, is that they were really making a lot of money off of Locky at that point, so they didn't necessarily need Drydex out there, so it wasn't as important to their money scheme at that point, or their money making. So that seemed odd. So like almost every time that there's a set of money mule arrests, there's a correlation in a rise in compromised hosts from that malware that was targeted in the money mule action. Does anybody know why, or any ideas why? Yes. Cool. Yeah. So the comment is that they're trying to refresh their stock. Maybe trying to refresh the compromised machines. I don't think it's necessarily that they're trying to refresh compromised machines. What they're trying to do is, the managers of the money mules have been arrested at this point, and they've kind of looked at it and maybe they think, oh, you know what, all these credentials that we've compromised, they're now burned. We can't use them. We need new credentials. We need new bank accounts that we can use in order to entice a new set of money mule actors to come on board and to make money from that. So that's the working theory at the moment that we have around that. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So cool. Any other comments? Anybody? No? Yes?
So the other thing that maybe stood out was, is it possible that people were aware of this and put in new detections and therefore more aware of it and the spike was in detection versus exploitation?
Cool. That's a really good question, and I've had that question a couple of times. The question being, as we deal with something and whenever there's one of these arrests, is that because new detections have been put into place and therefore you're measuring a greater amount of detections afterwards? Not in these graphs. In a later graph, I will point out that there is a situation when that did happen. Cool. Yes? The other question is, did the malware stay consistent? With Dridex, yes. Cool. Yes? Sunil.
It would be interesting to see if there's a similar behavior when it comes to drugs. Yeah, so drug pushers, drug lords, and when you have a bunch of lower level arrests, what happens in terms of subsequent actions, and I would suspect that there's a similar sort of bump as well.
I don't have any of that data, so I don't know.
So these mules that are being arrested, do you have any idea what percentage of the bad guys they represent?
I do not.
Okay. The reason I say that,
Oh, well, do you mean what percentage of the bad guys per these crews, or what percentage of the bad guys? I don't know what percentage of the bad guys overall they represent, but the percentage of the bad guys concerning these specific crews, I've got a good idea, I'll say. But now, so and why that's important, and maybe that's a good point, and that was actually a good point that was made last week too, which was, so yes, with this presentation, I am very narrowly focusing in on one kind of, if you were to call it like one group of people who are well connected to one another and have been a persistent threat to organizations since about 2004. Okay, if that makes sense. And these are kind of like, this is the core of Russian cybercrime in a way, in my opinion. These are the guys that are well connected, know how to monetize it. They are the real threat versus like a kid who, you know, popped your web server and posts credentials on Pastebin. You know?
my point would be, you said you don't have fraud data, and that's the demand. And so there's a risk that this implies this drives that, when in fact that pulls everything over. For example, you said, why in November did we have a big thing over there? In the fraud space, let's say credit card fraud or whatever kind of fraud we're talking about, the monetization of this might be the new iPhone coming out, which
Cool.
drives that. So there could be events that completely blow away your stats, and might describe those anomalies, and they might be at the end of the chain.
So Bo's concept, and he's got a few good points in there, which are that, which one of them is, and this is actually a bit that I'm going to, I had planned to mention later, which is, does it matter that more hosts are compromised by the malware, or does it matter that fraud has been prevented? You know, like, if fraud is the end goal, does it really matter if we've compromised hosts? You know, whereas fraud really matters more so. But then there's the other concept, which is, yeah, I'm kind of running out of time. Thanks, Bill. The The one kind of concept here, though, is, or one concept that I want to mention real quickly is there was that comment about there might be other alternative things going on that we don't know about. Yeah, I don't talk about that data set here, but some of these other drops can be explained by things that we've already pulled apart and put onto the timeline as well. I'm pretty positive that the things that I have here correlate with things, though, if I can say that. Cool. So yeah, I guess I'm running kind of low, but with the Drydex project, on average, we saw about 12 compromised hosts per week. And then when there was a Smilex arrest, previous to it, immediately previous to it, we saw roughly 22 compromised hosts per week. And then afterwards, we saw, after he was arrested, we saw roughly 15 compromised hosts per week. Oh. Cool. All right. Maybe I shouldn't have taken so many questions while I was talking. We don't, Sunil, we don't have any presentations. Yeah. Oh, okay. So, sure. Well, so I want to kind of show this real quick. So before the takedown, we were only at 15 compromised posts per week. After the takedown, we were at 33 compromised posts per week. And that's something that shows up in a few situations here, which are whenever there's a takedown, there's actually a rise in compromised posts. So people may be thinking that like botnet takedowns are actually going to impact or limit the amount of cybercrime that's going on. And from what I've been able to tell, in the case of both Drydex, Helios, Andromeda, or not Andromeda, but with Helios and Game Over Zeus as well, there's actually a rise in compromised hosts after a takedown. And that's pretty consistent across the board here. The case that doesn't show that is whenever Ars was arrested in Thanksgiving 2017, November 2017, and then Andromeda kind of atrophied and then was taken over shortly thereafter. So I tried to take a look and see, are we creating superbugs? And you know, Paul Vixie had put out that blog post about superbugs and how the takedowns were resulting in superbugs afterwards. And what I really found was that doesn't really show up in the data. Oftentimes after there's a takedown, there will be a less sophisticated version of the bot that comes out, and then it takes time before they become a more sophisticated version again. The one counterpoint is actually Helios. And then there's this situation as well, which was the Avalanche takedown. Avalanche was a bulletproof hosting provider, and what we saw was that over the entire time, the malware that's associated with Avalanche had roughly 821. So what I did here was I pulled out all of the malware that's associated with Avalanche and hosted on Avalanche, and I pulled the volumes of those over each month, and I tried to see whether or not that what that volume was over time. At the peak in 2015, there was roughly 1,600 detections per month that we detected, and then in 2016, it was still running strong at about 905 compromised hosts per month. In December 2016, there was the takedown. Afterwards, for the next year, we only detected 649 compromised hosts per month associated with the Avalanche-related malware. But then, since then, it's continued to decrease, and we have roughly 474 per month. So roughly what that means is that the Avalanche takedowns have resulted in a decrease in cybercrime amongst the cybercrime actors that were hosting malware on Avalanche. I tried to take a look at organized cybercrime in general, and it kind of goes up and to the left, which is roughly bad for cybercrime activity, compromised hosts. But so I guess that means that we're not really stopping organized cybercrime in general. Yes, question. That's a good question. Did the number of yes. Yes. So the question is, did we add more clients or more things that we're monitoring over this time? Yes, but normalized, there's still a greater increase. Yes, that's the raw count. Yeah. So I guess my conclusions are we may not be building super bugs, but takedowns, patches, and blog posts and other things that we're doing to maybe stop fraud are resulting in super criminals. We managed to stop the Dridex actors from performing large-scale fraud using compromised credentials, and then they've now pivoted into using opportunistic post-compromise ransomware attacks using BitPaymer. And when you buy a whole bunch of Bitcoin to pay a ransom, the banks don't help you get that money back. So that's maybe a much worse situation than them just stealing your money. And the only thing that's decreased the amount of compromised hosts is the rest of technical operators and their administrators. Cool. So I guess I'll leave this till maybe after the break, and we can take the break. But my kind of ending is, so what do we do about it? And it seems that just reporting cybercrime that's something that doesn't occur frequently. I was talking with the folks that are working the Dridex case, and they didn't have a Dridex victim come forward for multiple years, whereas lots of organizations have been compromised by Dridex. They can't keep a case open, and they can't justify working on a case if people don't open cases. So to work that better, establishing relationships with your local law enforcement and their leadership really helps. The leadership, so that whenever you're wondering why someone hasn't been arrested, you can call their leadership and say, hey, we want you to really be doing something about this. We shared all this data back. Yeah, and then incentives. We need to create some sort of incentives for that. Yeah. And then these are areas for further exploration. But yes. Sorry for taking extra time. Yeah. I guess I mistakenly thought since we had an hour afterwards I could go slower.
So we have a break right now, and we'll reconvene at 11 o'clock. I had a couple speakers drop out, so I do need to talk to other speakers and see whether we can fill the slots. So if you're a speaker, please come up and see me during the break. Thanks.
Check, check. Excuse me. Thank you. Check, check, check. No. Check, check. We're gonna swap you guys.
Oh, great. Thank you. This is awful. Hello, testing, testing. Good. Okay. All right. Can you guys come over here for a second?